Well, good morning. We're excited to have, as I clean up the children's message this morning, we have a new, like Marcy mentioned, a guest speaker, Paul Faust. He is the CCU pastoral, the campus pastor.
Yep.
And his family was here earlier, first service. They are a beautiful family, I can attest to it. 4 children, I only met 3.
Yep.
The 4th oldest one is around. We know where she is. She's good, but she wasn't here this morning. So, but let's go ahead and address the elephant in the room. When he asked someone to speak, he pretty much is like my twin brother, you know? Same height.
It's like looking in the mirror.
Yeah, same height. I mean, he's like a half inch. I'm 6'3" and a half.
Yeah,
6'4".
something like that.
Yeah. So we're like
yeah.
almost identical. Same weight, you know, pretty much. So it's pretty awkward, actually, that we look so similar. But anyways, I just want to introduce, make him feel welcome. Grace Fellowship, make Paul feel welcome this morning.
Thank you, guys. Well, yes, my new twin friend, I just appreciate Johnny. Thank you. As Johnny said, my name is Paul. I'm just excited to be with you this morning. I am the campus pastor over at CCU. We're going to spend a few minutes in the book of Exodus today, actually. And so if you have a Bible, you can turn there. There's Bibles right in front of you. If you don't have one, you can grab that. You can use it today, and you can actually take it home if you don't have a Bible. If you're using one of those Bibles from our chairs, we'll start on page 30 of that, the beginning of the book of Exodus, or if you have your own, you can turn there in your phone. We're going to kind of go through a lot of content today and kind of be skipping around the story of the Exodus, and so we won't really anchor in one place. But why don't we do this as we get rolling? I feel like I should start with an apology. I don't have cinnamon toast or popcorn for you. And so I guess we're starting off on the wrong foot. But I think there's some donuts and coffee and stuff in the back if you need that. But why don't I pray for us as we jump in, and then we'll get started. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for the wisdom that you offer to us through your word. Give us insight today. Help us to come to you with open hearts and open ears. God, we ask that you would guide our conversation, that we would be faithful to your word, because we know that there is so much important information that you have to share with us about who you are, about who we are, about where we're going in our lives. So guide us today. Help it to be exactly what you have in mind for this moment in each of our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, I want to begin with a question, and it may feel like an unfair question, but as we get to know each other, you'll probably learn I'm really fond, actually, of unfair questions. And so the question is this: what would you say is the most important story in the Old Testament? Now, it seems like an unfair question. Maybe something pops up in your mind. A natural place to go would be like the creation story, right? Like that's where everything begins. Or maybe one of the important heroes, like the story of David, who we just talked about a little bit, or the life of Abraham, for example, maybe one of the covenants. But if you read through the Old Testament, one of the things that you'll begin to notice is that God goes back to actually one particular story over and over and over and over again. And he encourages his people to go back to this story over and over and over again. And it's maybe not the one that you would first think of when you're thinking about your Old Testament and the stories that are in there. It's a familiar one, but it's actually the story of the Exodus. Maybe you've noticed this as you've read through the Old Testament. God answers 2 questions through the story of the Exodus. 2 of the most important questions that we can ask. The first one is, who am I? And as he talks to his people, now I want you to think about, like, you can go do this research on your own if you want to. You think about the Passover ceremony, for example, or you look at Deuteronomy 6, the story that God tells fathers to pass down to their children, the story that they are to talk about as an identifying story for how they think about themselves. He says, the story that I want you to tell over and over and over and over again is that we are God's people who were once slaves and now we are free. Maybe you've thought about the impact of specific stories in your own life. How do you think about who you are? Someone asks you, who are you? What comes to mind? What are the stories? What are the things? What are the parts of your life, your character? Maybe it's your job. Maybe it's how much money you own or where you live or where you're from, where you were born. Maybe it's something about your family. But what is the story that you use to anchor how you think about yourself? The story that God wanted His people to anchor their identity in was this idea that we were once slaves and now we are free. And I think this has incredibly significant consequences for how they thought about themselves and maybe even more importantly, how they thought about other people. And then we think about the question of who is God? A.W. Tozer once said, the most important thing about you is what comes to your mind when you think about God. And if somebody were to ask you, who is this God that you worship? How would you describe Him? What story would you go to talk about His character? When you think about Jesus, what picture comes to mind? What is He doing? That tells you a lot about how you think about God, how you think about what is most important. And there's this same story that God goes to over and over and over again to describe Himself. He says to His people, when you think about me, I want you to think about the fact that I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. The God who brought you out of Egypt actually specifically to bring you to myself so that we could be together, so that we could be in covenant with each other, so that you could know me and follow me. Isn't it interesting that out of all of the stories in the Old Testament, God chooses this one to answer these two core and primary questions? So I think it's worthwhile to dive into this. And the advantage that we have today is that the stories we're going to talk about are relatively familiar ones. Even if you're not super familiar with the Bible, or you haven't read it a lot, or you're just kind of exploring faith, these are ones that we make musicals and movies out of. And so at least the basic details we kind of know. But let me get us into the story. We've got to remember as we get into the book of Exodus, we've got to rewind to the end of the book of Genesis, because the author of Exodus wants us to remember that. That's where he's jumping off from. So at the end of the book of Genesis, you might remember that Joseph, he's gone to Egypt. He's brought his family with him. There's about 70 people. Now, that's a big family, but it's still just a family. And Joseph is actually the second most powerful man in the world at the end of the book of Genesis. He's the vice regent of Egypt, which is the richest, most powerful nation on the planet at this point, and he's second in command to Pharaoh himself. And so the Hebrews and their relationship with Egypt and their power and their place as a group of people at this point, they're doing well when they're starting off in Egypt. And so as we begin to read the book of Genesis, this is our mindset, right? And sometimes it's hard for us to get there because when we think of Egypt in the Exodus, but we haven't seen that yet. So things are actually really good in Egypt. But then we get to Exodus chapter 1, and we'll start in verse 8, and we have this phrase that the author really wants us to notice so that we know that, oh, now something is changing. In verse 8 of chapter 1, it says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." And so if we're watching a movie, this is when the music changes, right? And we get the oh no, something bad is about to happen. And as we continue to read the story, we find that something bad does in fact happen. This new Pharaoh, he's insecure, he's scared, he thinks that the Hebrews are too many, and so he enslaves them. And now they've gone from being this powerful, welcome group in the land of Egypt to being slaves. And as we continue forward in the story, you might have to flip a page, I'm not sure, but if we get to then Exodus chapter 2 in verse 23, we have this interesting sentence. It says, "During those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help." Now there's a detail there in that part of the story that you may not have noticed. It says that the Israelites cried out. Did you notice? They didn't cry out to anyone specific. See, in this story, we are now 400 years from Joseph. It's a long time. Anybody in the room remember 400 years ago? I'd be impressed. You read about it. It's before the United States was even a dream in anyone's mind. 400 years. And so for the Israelites, when they begin to cry out, they have some distant memory of this God who had a relationship with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. They have this distant, long ago memory of a God who did miracles, who somewhere in our distant past, he was in some special way our God. But for 400 years, they've been surrounded by Egypt. And you know, if you've gone to a museum, that Egypt was a deeply religious place. They had all these gods, and at this point, they're still the richest, most powerful nation on the planet, which in the mindset of the world at that time meant that their gods were the ones that were really in charge. And so one of the questions in the minds of the Hebrews at this point is, what has happened to our God? He's been silent for 400 years. And when you're in that situation, who do you pray to? They're not really even praying. They are just staring at the sky going, if there is anyone anywhere that can see our suffering and is willing to respond, would you hear us? And maybe the most important verse in this entire story, it begins in chapter 2, verse 24. If we skip back just a little bit to the second half of 23, it says, their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And I want you to notice the pacing of this sentence. It says, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. God heard. He remembered. He saw, and he knew. Remember, this is the story that God points us to again and again and again and again. And he says, look to this story to learn who I am. And what is that place in your life? Maybe right now, maybe in the past, maybe it's still coming. But that place in your life where you go, it feels like 400 years of silence. I don't know who I'm even talking to anymore, but I need something. I need help. I need rescue. So if anyone is listening, would you hear me and would you respond? Who is the God of the Exodus? Who is the God of the plagues? Well, according to this passage, he's the God who hears, the God who remembers, the God who sees, the God who knows. And what is it that God is motivated to do in this moment, in this story, when he hears the cries of his people who are suffering? Well, we know this is now the rest of the story. If we pick up in chapter 3, we know we meet a man named Moses. We've seen him before. I'd love to talk more about Moses. We don't have time to dig into his life, but he's such a fascinating study. And so God shows up in this strange burning bush, this bush that is on fire, that doesn't burn up, and God speaks and he gives Moses this name that is so mysterious. That's another whole conversation that I would love to talk about that we're not going to talk about today. But God says to Moses, I'm going to send you to the people of Israel who are suffering, and you are going to bring them out into the wilderness to be with me. This is what I have always wanted, is a group of people that I can teach and I can train and I can be in covenant relationship with, and I can send out into the world so that the whole world would know who I am. If you don't know that that was the purpose of Israel from the beginning, you need to take another look at Genesis chapter 12. But if we jump back into the story, one of the things that God says is, I'm going to prove myself to the people of Israel as well as to the Egyptians, and I'm going to do so by way of miracles. See, there's a problem that Moses has. Moses is right when he says to God, I don't think they're going to come with me. Remember, this is a world that has all kinds of gods. And it was not a world where people were used to the gods actually doing anything. In fact, most people assume the gods kind of hated them, and our job was to keep them from destroying us. But there were all kinds of gods. Some were more powerful than others. And because nobody was really doing any sort of actual miracles, the way we knew which gods were most powerful is we could look at which people had the most money and political power and military might. And that's how we know whose gods are most powerful. And so in their world and in their minds, the Hebrews are in this moment where they're looking at Moses. If Moses just shows up and says, hey, I'm bringing you out, I'm rescuing you from Pharaoh, God's gonna keep us safe and he's gonna take us out, the Hebrews are like, cool, man, that's nice. It's a great idea, but I don't think that you or God can do that. There's no way you're going to pull this off. And if Moses had just showed up on day one and said, hey, we're out, let's go, the Hebrews would have been like, good luck, bro. Right? Because that's the world that they live in. The Egyptian gods are so powerful. Pharaoh is so powerful that even if God does care about us and he wants to rescue us, I just don't think he can. Now, one of the things I don't think we spend enough time talking about is how funny the Bible is. There's a group of people in this story that is actually hilarious. And unless you know some of the details of this, you don't actually see how funny this is. So what God says is he says, I'm gonna make sure Pharaoh knows this is really me. I'm really speaking, and I'm going to make sure the people know. And so, Moses, what do you have in your hand? And he looks, and he's got a stick, because he's a guy who hung out with sheep for 40 years in the wilderness. And he's like, okay, throw your stick on the ground. He throws the stick on the ground, turns into a snake. He picks it back up, and he's like, do that, but just do it in front of Pharaoh, right? So they go, Moses and Aaron, they go in front of Pharaoh, and he's like, hey, listen, the God of the Hebrews wants them back. He wants them out of slavery. We're leaving. And Pharaoh's like, no. We know that part, right? But there's this group of magicians, and you need to know a bit of the technicality of the language to be able to understand this. See, there's multiple words for like snake or serpent, and some of them mean like a snake, like a cute little gardener snake. That's not what's in this story. It's actually a word that refers to like a crocodile or a dragon. So I want you to picture this for a second. Moses and Aaron are there in the courtroom of Pharaoh. Remember, this is a huge open place. There's all kinds of people around. It's very, very public. And that's going to become important as we go through this story. So they turn their staff into like a crocodile or a dragon, and it's like a well-trained dog. It's like just sitting next to Aaron. And so Pharaoh's like, I can do this. We can do this too. So he calls his magicians. Now, these magicians are these guys that keep making fools out of themselves over and over and over and over again through the story. But you need to know the details to be able to understand how funny it is. So they show up and they're like, oh yeah, we can totally do this. So they take their stick, they throw it on the ground, and it turns into a dragon or a crocodile or whatever this monster is. The problem is theirs is about to eat everyone, and it's completely out of control. So when Aaron's goes and eats theirs, and then comes back and sits down next to him because his is under his control and theirs is not, he has just saved the lives of everyone in the room. And this is a theme that shows up again and again and again and again with these magicians. See, here's why it's funny. All they ever do is make things worse. Do you notice that about this story? Like, okay, guys, can we talk for a second? Like, first plague. Does anybody remember what it was? What do they do first? Somebody said it. The water of the Nile turns into blood, right? And what do the magicians do to prove that they're powerful too? They make more blood. Like, we were actually good. Our blood supply we were full. In fact, that's why we're digging in the dirt over here like we're trying to find something to drink. The Nile has completely turned to blood. It stinks. It's terrible. All the fish are dying. No one has anything to drink or cook with, and you're making more blood? Really, guys? Like, maybe we could try taking away the thing that they did that's destroying our economy. Does that make sense? You guys follow me? Okay, so throughout this story, we have this group of people who just keeps making it worse. And it's part of what God is saying and showing is like not only do these Egyptian gods have no power to stop the destruction that God is sending, but all their servants can do is just make it worse by imitating the destruction that God has already given. So, there's a couple of things that we need to recognize about this, though, because this is one of those tough stories, isn't it? Maybe you've wrestled with this story. Maybe you're a person who's still not sure where you're at with God. Or maybe you've gone through, a process of coming to faith, but there's still these questions about the Old Testament and stories like this where you're like, I'm still kind of unsure. This makes me a little uneasy. And sometimes it even feels like we've got like this mad, mean Old Testament God and then nice Jesus, which is, it's okay. You just need to read the Bible a little more closely to be able to understand this. But this is one of the places that people often come at us as Christians and they're like, okay, you say you believe in a good God, but like, what about this? What about God killing people with rocks, ice rocks from the sky? What do you do here? And I think it's one of the places that we have to go, we need to lean into this. And of course, we don't have time to really do justice to a full conversation on that. But I do want to point out a couple of things that might be helpful to you. Because we do need to think about why God is doing all of this. And He actually does tell us. But one of the things I want you to notice is how the plagues actually happen. Now, if you don't know this, there's 10 of them. They take place over a pretty significant period of time. We don't have a timeline of this, but it's probably over the course of at least a few weeks that this is all going on. And every single time there's going to be a new plague, Moses and Aaron show up in the courtroom of Pharaoh. Now remember, that first plague we just talked about, where did that happen again? Anybody remember? At the Nile River. This is a very, very public place. So the first miracle happens in the courtroom of Pharaoh with a whole crowd of people watching. And remember, everybody knew who Moses was. He had been raised, he had grown up in the household of Pharaoh, and then homeboy disappears into the desert for 40 years. The prince disappeared for 40 years and then just showed up again dressing weird with a wife and kids and he walks up to Pharaoh, just walks into the palace and goes, "Hey, I'm taking 1 million people out into the desert." People are going to notice this, right? This is not a hidden private thing. Does that make sense? Especially when there's a crocodile eating another crocodile in Pharaoh's court. And then Moses shows up out at the river where people normally gather in the open, in public, and then he slaps the water with a stick and it all turns into blood. And that water is their water source. So God makes sure, by the way that He does the miracle, He makes sure that every single person in Egypt is affected. They all know what's going on. They all know who did it. And they all know that He is saying that there's a God who is the God of the Hebrews who is taking them away, and He's the one who's doing this. And there's a nagging, lingering question that they constantly have to ask because they believed in a God who was in control of the Nile. Where'd He go? What is He doing about this? His servants made it worse. But if there was a God of the Nile, don't you think He would clean it up? If there was a God of the frog, don't you think He would have stopped these millions of frogs from crawling up out of the Nile into our homes and then dying so that we have to clean them up with shovels? But I also want you to notice that the first half of these plagues, yes, they're destructive to the economy. Yes, everyone knows about them. Yes, the whole land stinks and there's dead animals all over the place. But really, at this point, these plagues are kind of an annoyance. No one's been harmed. No one's gotten sick except the normal natural flow of disease. But everyone knows that there is a God who is taking control of nature, and He does not seem to be on our side. It's also very important to recognize that the Hebrews live in a different place. They live in Goshen. The Egyptians didn't want themselves to be contaminated by those gross people that hung out with sheep, and so they put them out over here in a place called Goshen, and the Hebrews are like chilling at this point. They're good. They're not experiencing the impact of these plagues. So there's this clear separation where God is making it obvious that the people whose attention he is trying to get right now, it's not the Hebrews. They're just waiting. It's the Egyptians that God is trying to communicate with. So every single time God sends a plague, there's a warning, sometimes with an exact timeline of when it's going to happen, and then the plague happens exactly how and when Moses and Aaron say it's going to happen. So by the time you get to 5, 6, 7, these plagues that are a couple of weeks in, everyone is paying attention. Everyone knows when Moses and Aaron show up. Everyone knows what they say because they want to avoid, if possible, what's going on. And this is really important because we need to recognize that there's a change that happens. The 7th plague is very, very important because the 7th plague is the first time that humans die. The 7th plague is when we have giant hailstones coming from heaven. And what happens before the 7th plague? Remember, we've already had 6. And every single time that Moses has gone to Pharaoh and he said, here's what's going to happen, it has happened. So 6 times we've already been through this. And Moses shows up one day. And he says to Pharaoh, tomorrow, hail is going to fall from the sky, and the hailstones are going to be so big that if they hit you, you will die. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your wives, your children, your slaves, your servants, your livestock, everything that is alive. I want you to take it. I want you to pull it inside, into a house, into a barn, because that hail will kill you if you're out in the field. And remember, by this point, every Egyptian already had boils on their skin. This had gone from annoyance in the water to it's in my body. I can't ignore it anymore. And Moses shows up. He says, tomorrow, get all your people inside. Because hail is coming. Because God is going to show he is in control even of the weather. And what is the Egyptian god of weather going to do about it? We already know. Nothing. There's nothing he can do. So not to be too flippant about it, but there were people who died that day. Stupid people. People who weren't listening. People who somehow at this point did not believe that although Moses was 6 for 6, and he gave you exactly what you needed to do to avoid this plague, you still didn't listen. And I have to ask you, is that really God's fault? See, this story is challenging and it's complex because God does send plagues. God does send things that cause humans to die. And we can't shy away from the fact that God is, in some ways, harsh here. But I can't see a whole lot other than grace in the fact that he gives this warning after warning after warning after warning, and he tells them exactly how to avoid destruction. And sometimes we live this way, don't we? We say, God, I'm going to try it my way. I'm going to do it the way that feels good. I'm going to try not what you have warned me is going to destroy me. And then we face the consequences of our own stupid decisions and we go, God, why are you doing this to me? And I think he often looks at us and goes, really, this is my fault? See, the 7th plague becomes important, but we need to understand it. And if you want to read about that, you can, starts in chapter 9, verse 13. Then we have this plague after the 7th plague of locusts. And I just want you to get yourself into this story for a moment. I want you to think about what it would have been like to live through this. You live in the richest nation on the planet. Your life is good. You are immune from famine because the floods that the Nile gives you makes your crops grow like they grow nowhere else in the world. And you never in your life have had to wonder where your next meal is coming from. You have servants. You have gods who are protecting you. You have the most military might of anyone in the world. And your king is the most powerful king on the planet. But all of a sudden, one day, things start going awry. And your river has turned to blood, and there have been dead frogs all over your house. You've had these boils on your body, and you look out the window, and there are still dead animals from disease and from the hail that are sitting in your fields. The crops are almost gone. They're decimated, and now a plague of locusts so thick that it makes it seem like it's dusk comes and just wipes out any shred of food that's left. It feels like the world is ending. And then after one more warning, the sun shuts off. It's 10 a.m. and you can't go out your house. You can't see your hand in front of your face. You have no choice for 3 days but to sit by yourself in your home. I think there's two things you got to recognize about this. One is that the apex of the Egyptian pantheon, the most powerful god in the universe in the Egyptian mind, was the god of the sun. So this god of this group of slaves has just shut off the sun. And there is nothing that even Amun-Ra can do about it. But the other thing you got to recognize about this is that this gives every Egyptian 3 days to sit and to think about one question. What am I going to do with all of this? The world really might end. It seems like the cosmos is ripping apart. And you have to remember that all throughout the Bible, every miracle has a message. Every time God does a miracle, there's something that he's trying to communicate. And you got to remember the Hebrews at this point, they're still over in Goshen, like having a meal, chilling, getting a sunburn because the sun's still shining there. And so the whole point of this is not the Hebrews, it's the Egyptians. And every Egyptian is forced into 3 days of silent meditation in the dark to ask, what will I do with the fact that I can no longer deny that I am wrong about the most important things that I have always believed? And we know, and unfortunately we don't have time to dive into the 10th plague. It's the Passover. And somehow even then it seems that the Egyptians did not follow the example of the Israelites. But if you look through this story, and it starts in chapter 7, God, a number of different times, in chapter 7, verse 5, he says it as clearly as he does anywhere, God actually gives 3 reasons for the plagues. The reason he says most often as to why he is doing this. So he says, I am doing these great and mighty acts so that Pharaoh and the Egyptians would know that I am the Lord. Isn't that interesting? Now, the second reason is the one that we already know, that we think about most. He says, also, I am bringing my people out of Egypt. So it's not that that's not important. That is part of the purpose. But he says, first, I want Pharaoh and the Egyptians to know that I am the Lord. Second, I want my people out of Egypt. And third, I'm going to judge the gods of Egypt. And this is the one that's so interesting because a lot of people who are critical of this will say he's just, doing this death match between him and the Egyptian gods because he's arrogant, because he wants to. No, it's not about that. We have already seen he has this heart for the Egyptians that he wants them to know the truth, because you need to know something. If you are wrong about something very important, the best thing that can possibly happen to you is for you to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurts. And I hope you know that. See, God is presenting himself as a God who sees his people and who sees the Egyptians, and here's the kicker, who welcomes the Egyptians if they will just come to him. Probably never thought about that as part of this story, but I'm going to prove it to you in just a second. So, what do these plagues actually accomplish? I want you to think about being a Hebrew. We talked about this just a minute ago, and I think this is really crucial for us to understand that throughout the course of this story, if you are a Hebrew, you start the story in such a place that if Moses had come to you and said, "Come follow me, I'm going out into the desert, we're going to go to the promised land, it's going to be great," you're like, "Sorry, bro, don't trust you. I don't trust you. I don't trust God. You're going to have to prove something to me." And over the course of the plagues, over and over and over and over again, this same message proves itself to the Hebrews. You can trust me, and when I say come with me into the desert, I am going to follow through on what I have promised. See, steps of faith in following God are not blind. There is no such thing in the Bible as blind faith. God says, "Trust me," but I am willing to prove my trustworthiness. So for the Hebrews, the message is, "Come with me because you can trust me." There's a different message, though, for the Egyptians. And that message is, guys, you've been deceived. The things that you believe most deeply about the most important questions of life, your answers are wrong. And the best thing I can possibly do for you is to prove that to you. So here's the kicker. Did it work? Did God actually get the attention of the Egyptians? Well, there's a verse that I never noticed until I was in a master's degree studying this for a thesis. I finally saw it, and it jumped off the page at me. If you're looking in your Bible, you can flip to Exodus chapter 12, and it's an answer to a question. It's another question that seems relatively obvious. The question is, who left Egypt in the Exodus? Who crossed the Red Sea? Now, there's the obvious answer, right? It's the Israelites. And in all the movies, that's who crosses the Red Sea. But I have a follow-up question. Who else? It's a question you've probably never considered that the Bible actually goes out of its way to answer. Let's look at Exodus 12 together. In verse 37, we have the predictable part. It says, "The people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children." And then in verse 38, the part I had never seen, "A mixed multitude of others also went with them." Other slaves, other groups, other non-Israelites left Egypt with Israel and became a part of the people of God. Crossed the Red Sea, joined the covenant, and lived in the land of Canaan. So I want to ask you this as we close. Would you have been part of that mixed multitude? If you started this story as an Egyptian, as an enemy of God, do you have enough humility, honesty, and open-heartedness to actually listen when God challenges the things that you believe and proves to you that you're wrong about some stuff? It's an interesting thing to consider, isn't it? I also want you to consider, what have you believed about who you are and who God is? When you think about who God is, and when you think about the Exodus, is this one of those stories in the Old Testament that you're like, I don't want that in there. I'm just going to kind of skip over these hard parts of the Old Testament because I want nice God that I see with Jesus? Or are you willing to say, no, He is the God who does whatever it takes, who is good to His enemies? We love Romans 5:8, right? While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. These are the things that God does for His enemies, and all we think about is the cross. What about the Exodus, where God went to great lengths to prove to the Egyptians who had enslaved His people that He wanted them to? And is that how you live your life? How do you interact with people who are far from God? Do you approach them with this same kind of tender truthfulness that God shows in Exodus? I'm going to pray in a minute, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to consider and process a little bit of that. And we're also going to take communion. I know you guys do this every week, which I love. One of the things I love about communion is this is communion, the Lord's Supper. This is the New Testament version of this story because it's the one that Jesus says, remember this moment. Every time you gather, every time you are together, do this in remembrance of me. And I don't know if you know this, it's the same story. Who are you? If you're a believer, if you've ever come to that place of faith where you've said to Jesus, yes, I believe that you died for me and I received that free gift of salvation. If you've ever done that, you are a person who has gone from slavery to freedom. You have been rescued by grace. And your answer to the question, who is God? You can take it from the Exodus, you can take it from the cross. He is the God who rescued you. He sought you out, He brought you out, and He wants you to live now a life of freedom in covenant with Him. That's what we remember. And it's not some pie-in-the-sky religious thing. It's something that really happened, and you can prove it. So what do you do with all this? Well, I think if you're a person who's not sure about Jesus, or you've never come to that place of faith, maybe in a minute when I pray, you're going to just say something very simple like, Jesus, I know I'm a sinner, I've done things wrong, but I believe Jesus died for me and I received that free gift of salvation. You're going to become a Christian today, and you're going to take communion for the very first time as a believer in Jesus. Maybe for you, you're a person who's like, you know what, I've had these places in my mind and in my heart where I know that I don't actually trust God. And maybe this story has helped me realize that it's not about me trying to find something within myself to trust Him. It's actually about me getting to know Him and seeing that He actually has already proven Himself and He is already trustworthy, and saying to Him, okay, I get it. Maybe for you, it's about your heart towards others. Maybe it's about how you think about and talk about and pray for and interact with people who are far from God. Maybe today you need to go to Him and say, God, I'm sorry that I have not looked very much like you in the way that I have interacted with people that I now know more than ever that you love. So I'm going to let it be silent for just about 15 seconds before I pray, and I want you to just go to the Lord and open your heart and ask Him what you are to do in this moment. Lord Jesus, we thank you for the ways that you have proven yourself to us. We thank you for the Exodus and the way it aligns our hearts and our lives more closely with you and with who you are, both for us and for others. We thank you for the cross, for the forgiveness that we find there. We thank you that faith in the Bible is not some leap out into the dark, but it is anchored in your truth that you offer to us. So we ask that you would help us today to respond in whatever way is most appropriate to our situation in this moment in our lives. We trust you because you've proven yourself, and we thank you for that. We ask for the humility and the courage to follow you wherever it is that you lead us. Amen.